All right guys, welcome back to the garage. Now today is the day that we finally get the SRT4 swap back in the truck for good. Now it's been a lot of work to get to this point, like relocating the steering rack so that we could have clearance for the oil pan and get the engine low enough in the truck. We had to convert to manual brakes so we have room for an intake manifold. And then the last thing we did is rebuilt this Stratus NA motor with SRT4 internals, Crowder cams and valve springs, and it's finally ready to go in. Now before we get started, there's some things that we had to do behind the scenes to get the truck ready for the swap. So let me get you guys caught up. Now you can see the firewall needed some major attention and it needed done before the engine goes in for the final time. So I started with pulling everything off the firewall, like the wiper motor, throttle and hood cables. Then in the cab, the heater box had to come out, and with the firewall clear, I gave it a good scuff, followed by a good clean with some wax and grease remover. Then it was ready for some paint, and I went with a couple coats of matte black. I just thought it would look cool, and I couldn't be happier with how it turned out. But now with that done, I was able to start bolting things back on the firewall, like the pedal assembly, brake and clutch master cylinders, and of course, I couldn't put that heater box back in all nasty, so I gave it a good clean, put a new blower motor in it, evaporator, and a heater core. With that done, it could go back in, and I decided to get the floor cleaned up, and I started lining it with some sound deadening. So a lot's been done. Let's get this swap back in the truck. Now the first thing we need to figure out is the oil drain. This is a newer block, so it is cast for where the drain would be in a turbo block. It's just not drilled and there's no fitting there. Now I thought I was going to use that, but the starter is going to sit right there. So you can see the starter is going to sit there basically blocking that port. Plus with this manifold, it's going to sit the turbo forward on the engine, and the center section is going to be right about here. So having a drain come and curve and then go into the boss on the block, just not ideal. You want something more vertical because you're relying on gravity to drain the oil from the turbo. So I got this little fitting, and I think I'm going to put it in the oil pan right there. That way we have a nice vertical drain going right to the pan. And when we pull this oil pan, one of the things we need to do is make sure there's no clearance issues. And already I see the boss of the balance shaft assembly is right there against the pan. So I think if I move as close to this bolt as possible, we'll be in business. Just because there are some threads that protrude past the pan, so I line that up, go right there. It should be good. It should drain right there above the balance shaft assembly and not have any clearance issues. So yeah, we just need to get as close to this bolt as possible. So that bolt hole right there is where we need to get close to. So I'm thinking something like right there, staying on this flat edge before getting to the curve. And we definitely want to get as high as possible. That way it's not submerged in oil. All right, I got the pan all cleaned up my hole. Now this fitting is a bolt-in fitting, it's not a weld-in. So it's got two of these washers with rubber on the inside. Then I want to throw some of this Loctite thread sealant before we put the nut on. All right, now we throw the pan back on. All right, drain fitting's done. So now the oil drain is taken care of. Next thing we need to do is move this pressure sensor because like I said, the starter is going to sit right there. So all we're going to do is swap it with this plug right here. This is an oil plug. Eventually we'll put some fittings in here to also be an oil feed. But for right now, we're just going to move this plug to here, temporarily put the sensor in here, just so when we get this off and the transmission bolted to it, we can mock up the starter. All right, I think with those things done, we can finally get this thing off the engine stand. So I'm going to do that. And then once it's off the stand, we can do the rear main, flywheel, and clutch. All right, engine's on the ground. So now we can put our rear main seal in. All right, for a flywheel, we're just using the factory Dakota flywheel that came out of the truck. That way we can use a Dakota clutch setup and we won't have any spacing issues when it comes to the throwout bearing. So this should just bolt right on to the 2.4 crank. I'm just going to make sure all these thread in before I add some Loctite. All right, all torqued down. And these are just the Dakota factory flywheel bolts because they match the thickness of this flywheel. So we should be good to throw the clutch on. All right, for clutch, this is just an eBay stage 3 clutch for the Dakota. It is a 6-puck sprung disc and then their pressure plate. I don't know how good this clutch is going to be. I mean, you can't really buy a lot of aftermarket clutches that are Dakota specific with the right spline count for the AX15. You could mix match pressure plates with discs. I suppose you could get a early turbo Dodge pressure plate because it's essentially the same flywheel, but I think the turbo Dodge flywheels are more hollow behind here and lighter than the Dakota ones, but we're gonna rock this and see how it goes. I do have an ACT pressure plate and flywheel for SRT4 that's specific to the SRT4 that would have bolted on here, but the thickness of the ACT flywheel and clutch setup is way thinner than what the Dakota stuff is. So if I were to go that route, I would have to figure out a way to space the throwout bearing closer to the clutch fingers on the pressure plate, just because there'd be a lot of dead space there. So instead of going that route and trying to figure out spacing and all that, this setup should go right on here and the transmission should bolt right on here and we should have no spacing issues with the throwout bearing and clutch and all that. So if this slips, we'll have to figure something else out. All right, it's torqued down. Our alignment tool goes in nice and easy. So the transmission should slide right on there. All right, it's time for the transmission to go on the engine. Now this is an AX15 transmission from this truck. So it's a two-wheel drive AX15. The only things I've done to it is spent way too much time cleaning it with a Dremel and a wire wheel, and I replaced the rear output shaft seal. We got a new throwout bearing. Then one thing I had to do is shave a little bit off the tip of the input shaft so that it fits into the crank of the 2.4. It was just the tiniest bit too long. All right, if you didn't watch the test fit video, this is the modification we had to do to make this trans match up to the 2.4. Since this is an early Chrysler 2.5 bell housing, you can see it does not match. So what I did is had to notch the transmission, stick a bolt in there, and then I made this little adapter piece that slides on there like that. And then we can thread a bolt in here and thread a nut on here And then that essentially is going to lock the transmission and engine together on this side. All right, the last thing we need to do is fit the starter. Now, regardless if you're using this rear-wheel drive AX15 for the 2.5 or you're using an older turbo Dodge front-wheel drive transmission, you're gonna have the same issue where this bolt is gonna run into the block. So we're going to do two things: grind on the block and modify this screw. So the first thing I'm gonna do is pull this out and then check to see how close we are. Okay, with that bolt removed, let's test it out. And we're a lot closer, but it's still hitting on the block right there. So now it's time to grind on the block. All right, got some grinding done on the block. Not a fan, but it is fitting better. It's rubbing right there on the starter. So I can see witness marks where it's rubbing on the block, and I believe it's on this boss right there. So I'm gonna grind that down a little bit and check it again. All right, I got it really close. You can see how much I had to take off of that boss there, and it started to get into the screw that's in there, but it's super close. So I put some grease on that bung. So I'm gonna stick it in there one more time and see where the grease touches. And if there's any grease on there, that's where I'll grind it, and we should be good, except for we'll have to remake this rod, which we'll get to in a minute. And you can see how much of the block I had to take off. Not a lot. If you tried to keep this rod straight, you'd have to take a lot more off of there or the rod. So let's see how this fits. Go. So it's seated all the way against the transmission. I still feel like it's a little high back here, so it's tilted, but we should be able to sit it like that. Take it off nice and easy. And there we go. We got our little grease up there. None where I grinded, so I think I'm just going to take some more off of the front there. That could be from where I slid it in, but I think we're very, very close. All right, it's bolted in, and I took this piece of paper and I was able to slide it back behind the starter where we grinded on the block, and then I went underneath and slid it between the starter and the block where we ground on the starter itself, and it's not touching. So the only issue we have left is this threaded rod that sandwiches the motor here, and you can see there's no way it's fitting with the block in the way, and I am not grinding any more of the block to make this rod fit. So what I'd like to do is have a rod that comes in, comes up, goes over, back down, and then through this hole, and we can put a nut on this side and a nut on this side. That way we can sandwich this motor together. So that's going to take some work. Let me do some digging and some brainstorming on how I'm going to make that work, and I'll get back to you guys when I figure it out. All right, here's what I came up with. It's just a little bracket. I just found a piece of metal that spanned between the 2 points. Got a Allen head bolt threaded into the factory threads. Then I have a bolt coming this way with a nut securing on this side, and it sandwiched this together. Then I clearanced it to fit around the block. So along with that bracket, the clearancing right there on that boss of the starter, and then the block, we should be good to bolt this thing in. All right, guys, it's bolted in. It's not touching anywhere. Fully seated against the transmission. So now let's get to swapping the truck. Oh, and one more thing. I did get a replacement transmission mount, and I did a little window weld fill. Try to make it a little firmer to match the motor mounts. Guys, I can't believe it's finally back in. I mean, just look at it. Look how good it looks sitting in here. Now you guys kind of see my theme with the black and all the yellow zinc hardware everywhere. I kind of went a little crazy with all the hardware, but I think it looks so good having the yellow on the black. So shout out boltsandnuts.com because they hooked it up with all this hardware. I can't believe they've had everything I've needed. I placed like 6 orders and I haven't even touched the back of the truck. So with the engine finally in here for good, we're in a good place where things can start happening like for real, like finally mounting the turbo for real, the manifold for real, injectors, fuel rail, fuel system, which shout out to Evil Energy because they jumped on board the Dakota project and sponsored a bunch of fuel lines, fuel pressure regulator and stuff. So that's pretty awesome of them to do that for me. Especially since I'm just a small channel, it's awesome that a company like that would support a small channel like mine, especially when there's so many big names out there that can promote their products probably better than I can, just like the guys at Z Automotive that have been with me almost from the beginning. Another big company supporting a small channel like mine. You know, those guys, along with Evil Energy, really help out small channels like mine to grow and gain traction and all that kinds of stuff. So I think the plan is to start doing some small videos, short videos. So we'll just do a video on getting accessories on here. We'll do a video on getting the intake manifold fitted with fuel injectors, fuel rail, getting everything buttoned up on that. Then we'll do a small video on the turbo. We'll get the turbo mounted, wastegate, oil lines plumbed and all that. And then it'll be time to do probably the fuel system or wiring, which if you're new here, what we have is a full engine bay harness, engine harness, and dash harness from an SRT4 along with the cluster. So we're gonna try to put the cluster in the dash and it's gonna be all SRT4 wiring as well as a PCM from an SRT4, and we have HP tuners to tune it. So it's not gonna be long till I'm reaching out to the tuner and saying, hey, I need a startup tune. So I hope you guys are excited as I am to get this thing running. I cannot wait to hear it run. I appreciate all the guys watching the videos, making comments, commenting on my Facebook stuff. I love the engagement and all the positive attitudes. So if you're new here, do the YouTube stuff. Don't forget the bell so you don't miss the next video. And I'll see you guys on the next one.